Okay, so we are now in what will be the fourth and I think the final World War II video. And I'm going to try to run through this pretty quick, mostly because I'm sure you're tired of hearing about this, and I'm starting to get tired of talking about it, mostly because I've done it all in like the last 2 hours. But anyway, so it's about 9:15 for me. We're going to talk about this is the part of the war that I think captures our imagination. Typically when you talk about World War II, people think of, oh my gosh, Pearl Harbor, everybody, we're going to go kick some, fascist butt, right? And we go fight, and we took a few defeats, and then we fought in some jungles, and then you have D-Day, and then we defeat Germany, and then we drop the atomic bomb, and boom, it's done, right? The reality is it was a much longer process. So you have in January of 43, the Casablanca Conference, where Churchill and FDR decide that they're going to strike at Italy first. And again, you have Eisenhower and Patton. Two names you need to know. Eisenhower is the Supreme Allied Commander in charge of Europe. And then you've got George Patton, his right-hand man. George Marshall is the, what is his title? Chief of Staff. George Marshall is not in charge in the sense of he's not a general on the ground, but George Marshall is the military guy that's over kind of orchestrating everything. So you want to be sure you know the name George Marshall. He's very important in making sure that the military has everything they need. And he'll be very important when we get to the post-World War II world, and he comes up with a plan to kind of facilitate the rebuilding of Europe. So we're going to see that in July of 43, we start attacking up through Italy. And again, Mussolini actually loses, or he actually gets taken over by the King of Italy. The King of Italy tries to surrender. Well, he does surrender, but then the Germans come in and they kind of reclaim the top half of the boot of Italy. And so what you see is that you basically have a fight between the Germans and the Americans. Now, many would argue that it's having to shore up Italy that causes Germany to have the losses that it has in 1943 against the Soviet Union. And I think that's a valid assessment. But certainly it's not a cakewalk for the Americans. You have to understand that at Cassino, you have this incredible battle. The Americans are completely holed up. And this actually ends up being a long campaign that results in a lot of casualties, very difficult campaign. So eventually we'll begin to have some success there. Once we begin to have a little bit of a foothold in the southern part of Italy, you'll see us moving up through the southern part of France as well. But again, that invasion is not nearly as big or strong as what we're going to see with D-Day. Then what you're going to see in late 43, so this is the fall of 43, they're going to meet in Tehran in the Middle East. FDR, Churchill, Stalin will be able to be there now because at this point, at the end of 43, Germany's really on the ropes, right? They're having to backtrack. And the Soviets are doing well enough that Stalin can afford to go travel for a conference. And what you're going to see at the Tehran conference in 43 is a number of agreements that are going to matter, because when Stalin doesn't fulfill them in 45, this is going to be kind of the foundation for the Cold War. Stalin basically agrees that at the same time that the Americans and the British launch their invasion of northern France, that he's going to launch an eastern invasion in order to kind of like sandwich the Germans in between. They also agree that after World War II, they're going to break Germany into pieces, right? That they're going to have it kind of under a protectorate for a little while in order to prevent it from becoming a world power. And I think that's an important concept because this division of Germany is going to be a foundation for the Cold War and several different conflicts, from the Berlin blockade, the Berlin airlift, to eventually the Berlin Wall, to the Cuban Missile Crisis, you name it, right? There's going to be a number of confrontations that are tied to this division of Germany, up to and including Ronald Reagan's speech in 1987, 1988, calling on Gorbachev to tear down the wall and that kind of thing. You're also going to see that the Soviet Union promises to declare war on Japan officially after Germany's out of the picture. Notice that Stalin doesn't guarantee that. He just says, well, once Germany is officially subdued, we will do this. This, again, is going to be a sticking point. They also agree to the creation of a peacekeeping organization. So be sure you understand those concepts. The landing in France, in northern France, is also called Operation Overlord, also called D-Day. Again, Eisenhower's in charge. You have, if you've ever seen, there's a thing called Operation Paperclip, which is the whole intention to kind of mislead Hitler that the invasion was going to come at Calais, not at Normandy. They literally, I mean, they do all kinds of stuff, from having decoys and like cardboard cutouts of tanks and military equipment. They even have a dead body float up on the ocean or on the shore with planted plans that kind of are meant to convince Hitler that it's Calais that they're going to target. The target all along had been Normandy. Now, Normandy is in the western part of France, northwestern part. The idea is to attack there and then sweep through and basically push the Germans out of France, right? Rather than attacking close to Germany and then have to deal with having Germans at their front and at their back, they'll just kind of sweep them ahead of them. And so this is going to take a huge amount of effort. If you've ever watched Saving Private Ryan, of course, that's the quintessential movie of that. Band of Brothers also has a really good D-Day episode as well. So this is going to be, D-Day had a window in June. There was a window in July. They weren't sure when the weather was going to hold. And because of the type of operation, the tide had to be just right. The moon had to be just right. The weather had to be just right. It was really kind of one of those unique things. Finally, the weather breaks and they start the attack. Big thing are the 5 different beaches. Be sure you know that Utah and Omaha were the American beaches. And what you're going to see is that the British and Canadian forces go to Gold Sword and Juno. And again, it's going to be Omaha Beach is the one that's the most brutal, right? Utah Beach is not a cakewalk, or none of these are a cakewalk. But what you definitely see is that it's Omaha Beach. That's the one that's, Saving Private Ryan, right? It's just incredibly dangerous. You have the Germans entrenched up on these cliffs, and they've got these big guns, and the Americans have to fight their way up, and it's really amazing when you realize the number of Americans and young men and the way people gave their lives, and it's just, when you think about it, it just really takes your breath away. The level of sacrifice. We call them the greatest generation, and things like that are often overstated. I mean, they're just ordinary people doing their thing, but that's part of what makes it so great, right? I mean, these are just ordinary Americans that in many ways they're no different than us, but they are, after going through the Great Depression and dealing with everything they've dealt with, and now they're fighting this war. And it's not that people are perfect, or they're not racist, or they're not greedy, or they're not selfish, or anything like that. It's just that you have this kind of overall, like I said, this broad picture of an American society that's just, putting all their differences aside for one thing. And it's just, if there's ever those moments in history where you look at the United States and you think, wow, there really is something special. World War II is one of those. I would argue that in a different way, the Civil War is that. I would argue that the American Revolution is one of those. And you just have those moments that are just absolutely incredible. So that's kind of the European campaign. So the Americans will push into D-Day in June of 44. Also happening about the same time is going to be the island hopping campaign. Again, this really begins after the Battle of Midway. And what you're going to see is that Nimitz, in particular, the Marines, are going to focus on taking islands, getting closer to Japan itself, whereas MacArthur and the Army are going to focus on going up through New Guinea, back up to retaking the Philippines. The idea of controlling the Philippines is to stop the trade routes, to limit the access that Japan has to trade, while the Navy and the Marines are trying to get closer to actually launch an attack, to have, bombing raids and that kind of thing. You want to be sure you understand the notion of island hopping. Lots of, and there's so many battles here. I mean, I have a few listed on the PowerPoint. Just understand that these islands, they're reef islands. They're hard to land on. Takes a great deal of ingenuity. This is where the amphibious vehicles, amphibious trucks become very important. And the whole goal of this is to get close enough to launch bombing raids, right? And so all of this is going to start really being incredibly dangerous. Every single, we think about D-Day as being this massive beach landing, and it was. But understand that the island hopping campaign is a series of smaller beach landings. But remember that the Japanese don't fight the way the Germans do. The Germans would fire, strafe them with machine guns. But once you took out the machine guns, you were good, right? Or at least good until you went to take the next territory. But in Japan, or in the South Pacific, what would happen is that the Japanese would dig in and have these kind of like hidey holes where there would be a small group of 7 or 10 or 15 of them. And they would let the Americans get on the beach, and they would, they'd start to unload their stuff and get situated. And then the Japanese would attack, right? And they would booby trap stuff. I mean, so fighting in the Pacific was just much nastier and much harder, in a way, than fighting in Europe, because in Europe it was very kind of straightforward in the sense of, we're starting at point A, we're trying to get to point B, and we're going to fight everybody that's in our way. And we get to point B, we take a breath, and then we fight to point C. Whereas in the Pacific, it was, you just never knew where the attack was going to come from. Guadalcanal, MacArthur, they start fighting in August of 42. It's not until 44 that they actually begin to threaten the Philippines. Philippines, Leyte Gulf, that's the big one that kind of helps us gain the Philippines in 44. Again, lots of aircraft carriers. This is another story of the Japanese basically backing off. The battle was actually a very tense battle. It could have gone either way. But the Japanese at one point decide that they've taken too many losses, and so they're gonna retreat. The reality is, if they had stuck it out, they might have actually won and kept the Americans from gaining headway in the Philippines, but they don't, thankfully. And so the Americans, then take over. And again, you have lots of casualties in the Philippines. This is the other part of the Pacific campaign. Just the incredibly increasing number of casualties. The closer you got to Japan, the more people died. Don't forget that the Holocaust is going on too. That Germany has not, that they're in their, what is that, purifying campaign, getting rid of all the German or Jewish people in Germany. So you need to be sure you understand that. Now, because we're not world history, we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about the details of the Holocaust. If you're super curious about something, ask me. In a nutshell, you've got the Germans creating these death camps, creating these labor camps. It's Americans knew something was up. I mean, this is the thing that always gets me about the Holocaust. It's not that we didn't know that the Germans were doing something they shouldn't, there was kind of this vague awareness. There had been reports coming back, right? But nobody really wanted to believe that it was really that bad. And then, of course, the Americans begin to stumble across some of these camps. And that just becomes incredibly, then you can't escape that. And there's this real sense that we don't ever want to let that happen again. But let me remind you that it's not just the Germans, right? It's Stalin, it's the Japanese. In a far lesser way, even the Americans with the Japanese internment camps. There's plenty of unfortunate behavior going on in World War II. Now, obviously, the Holocaust is incredibly efficient and organized, and there's records, and it's so very, targeted. Like there's no, it's, the Japanese hated anybody who wasn't Japanese, but once you weren't Japanese, it didn't much matter what you were, right? For Stalin, it was, do you support Stalin or do you not? The Germans have this very unique, approach to the Holocaust that tends to make it more kind of seem horrific. But that's a philosophical discussion rather, I think. But just be sure that Americans are pretty horrified when they discover the effects of the Holocaust. And there becomes this movement towards having war crimes. This certainly is true as we begin to realize what happens, not only in with the Holocaust and the prisoner of war camps and stuff like that, but also with the prisoner of war camps in Asia. Now, I think it's interesting that we never hold Stalin accountable for the way he treated German POWs. Because after the defeat of the Germans at Stalingrad, you have a number of German POWs that are never heard from again. So they, the Soviets do some pretty awful things themselves to Germans and German soldiers in particular. But that being said, we don't hold him accountable at all. But that's what you get for being an ally, I guess. So as we're pushing through in 1944, island hopping, getting closer and closer and closer to Japan, getting closer to the Philippines, regaining the Philippines. What you see is that we've gained that foothold in northern France. We're starting to push through. You have this whole issue of hedgerow fighting that's going on. Hedgerow, I don't think the hedgerow fighting would be on the STAR test. It's awfully specific. This is kind of the picture of it. If you've watched Saving Private Ryan, this idea that you're walking along a field and there's nothing in this one field, and then you cross a tree line and all of a sudden there's a German gun. That's the notion of hedgerows. Understand that in Europe, they divide fields with these tree lines that are made up of stones and trees and bushes and stuff. And so it's not the fences like we have here in Texas, where you have a barbed wire fence that separates a pasture, but you can see both pastures. Well, that's not the way it is with a hedgerow. And so one of the struggles that American soldiers have is that they're taking these fields and they have to go into each section blind, and they could be right next to a German section and not even know it, right? So this is one of the struggles of retaking France. This will also help them happen in Belgium as well. And of course, there's actually some more significant fighting in Belgium that there was Operation Market Garden, but it's not nearly as crucial to the overall story of American involvement. Plus, it's actually a defeat, so I suspect that's one reason why we don't like to talk about it. The Battle of the Bulge is kind of the last gasp of the Germans. This begins in December of 44. They push back to try and retake part of France. And of course, it's winter, so it's cold. The Allies get their butt kicked for a little bit. The city of Bastogne gets surrounded. This kind of shows you right here. So here's Germany, here's Belgium, here's France. So this would be kind of like the Pacific Ocean would be over here. And why is this not connecting? Please tell me it's still recording. I hope so. And so you basically have the Pacific over here, and you're going to see that the Germans will try to swoosh through or speed through. Their big problem is going to be resources. Bastogne is this little circle right here. That little circle right there is in France. And of course, you can see that the Germans have kind of enveloped that city, but the Americans hold it. What will happen is that Patton will sweep in and basically rescue the Americans. And the Germans will run out of resources, so they won't be able to really do anything about it. And so this is going to be kind of a huge, huge defeat for the Germans. This is going to, by the time you get to January 45, they've been defeated at the Battle of the Bulge, and they're starting to get pushed back into Germany, and the Americans are on the advance. But you can see from these pictures right here how incredibly cold it was. There's so much snow, miserable conditions that particular winter. If you ever hear, there's all kinds of video clips on YouTube or whatever of soldiers talking about the Battle of Bastogne and how miserably cold they were. So what you see is that, oh, my internet connection is wonky. I hope it stays. So you have Victory in Europe Day. VE Day is going to be April of May of 1945. You're going to see that the Soviets are sweeping in from the east, the Americans from the west. You're going to have Hitler committing suicide on April 30th. Actually, FDR is going to die, I think, April 12th. Is that what it is? And by April 21st, of course, the Soviets are in Berlin. Incredible chaos in Germany. Like, the Germans were so terrified of the Soviets. They were freaking out. You had people committing suicide. You had people, just absolutely terrified. They wanted the Americans to come through first because there was a sense that the Americans would be more fair. They knew that the Soviets were furious because they had violated the pact, because they had invaded Russia itself. They knew there was going to be some revenge. And indeed, the Soviets are not very nice to the Germans. So anyways, you have the Germans being kind of sandwiched between the two, this unconditional surrender on May 7th and this Victory in Europe Day. Then we're going to see, here's some more huge celebrations in New York, right? London, you name it. However, the war is not completely over. Again, FDR dies. There was a Yalta conference in January, early February of 45. The Yalta conference, they basically decide for kind of what post-war Europe's going to be, because by early 45, they know that Germany's going to be defeated, right? I mean, they know how it's going to end. The question is when. And so what you have is this is the last time that FDR will meet with Churchill and Stalin. You have kind of this agreement to allow democratic elections in Europe, especially in these territories that the Soviets are sweeping through. You have, more discussion about how they're going to partition Germany and that kind of thing, an affirmation of the promise to declare war on Japan, and that kind of thing. So Yalta takes place, and by April, FDR is dead. And Harry Truman becomes the president. And he's the one that's left finishing it up. Now, understand that Harry Truman didn't really know a whole lot about what was going on as far as he didn't know anything about the Manhattan Project or anything like that. So it's a real crash course for him. So he comes in, right before FDR dies, you have the invasion of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is another terribly bloody, awful fight. I mean, along the same scope of D-Day, right? Except we don't often talk about Iwo Jima. What we talk about instead is going to be D-Day. But Iwo Jima is definitely, one of those battles that's just really awful. Mount Suribachi, this is where you have, if you've seen Flags of Our Fathers, this is where the Japanese have all these tunnels dug into the volcano. Lots of booby traps. You have lots of Americans getting kind of ambushed, that kind of thing. So it's really pretty awful. Fighting, very difficult landings, that kind of thing. And so it's a pretty rough thing. Man, my internet's wonky. I think I'm going to pause this if you guys will give me a second. If it will pull up. There we go.